I'm going to be talking about getting started on your first crochet project today. So this video is specifically about our Learn to Crochet kit, and so these are the things that are going to be included in your kit, but this is going to apply to getting started with any project. So the first thing that you want to do is gather the supplies that you'll need and make sure you have the right supplies for the project that you're doing. So the first thing that people think about the most is going to be your yarn. You want to make sure that you get yarn that is the same thickness that the pattern is calling for. So in this case, it is a worsted weight, which is that number 4. That's the most common thickness of yarn out there. And you want to get the crochet hook that is going to be the size recommended. So this crochet hook has the size printed on it, and most of them do. It's a 5.5 millimeter, which is again what the pattern is recommending and what that thickness of yarn usually recommends. It's also nice to have a pair of scissors or yarn snips, a tapestry needle to weave in your ends when you're finished, and a tape measure if you're working on something that's going to say work however many inches before you go. So it's nice to have all of your supplies in one place so that you're ready to go and get started. So once you're actually ready to begin, you will want to take the ball band, so that's just the piece of paper that comes with your ball of yarn. Take that piece of paper off. I would recommend keeping the paper because it's going to give you important information like the name of the yarn, the color, the dye lot, all of that kind of stuff. But you don't need to keep it on your yarn while you're working. So once you're working with your ball of yarn, so this is a yarn that is in what's called a cake. So it was a skein and it was wound on a regular ball winder into a cake. A lot of hand-dyed yarns or small company yarns may come in this kind of a shape, or you may wind your own ball into this kind of shape. There are a lot of other shapes that balls of yarn can come in, but all of them are going to have in common that you will need to find the end before you get started. So you're always going to have 2 ends of every ball of yarn. You're going to have the end that comes from the outside of the yarn. So you can see as I'm unraveling this end of yarn is coming from the outside of the ball. If you are working your crochet project and pulling from this end, your yarn is not very likely to get tangled up, but your ball of yarn is going to kind of roll around as you unravel it. The other option for an end comes from the center. You can kind of dig around in there and pull out the yarn from the center if you can find it. This can be a great option for getting started. Your ball of yarn will not. So here's the end there that comes from the center. As you pull from the center, your ball of yarn is not going to roll around. It's just going to sit in one place. But as you keep pulling, eventually you're going to hollow out the middle of this ball. So this is a ball of yarn that I have pulled from the center. You hollow out the middle of the ball of yarn, and depending on the project, you may find as you get to this point and the ball collapses, it may start to tangle up on you, and you may need to stop and untangle it. So there's pros and cons to pulling from both directions. It is completely up to you which way you want to go with that. I generally these days prefer to pull from the outside just because I don't like untangling yarn. So that is where I'm going to get started. So once you've got the right yarn, the right thickness, the right crochet hook, your other materials gathered, and you found the end of the ball of yarn that you want to work with, you are going to be tying a slip knot. Now, if you already know how to do this, any way works. If not, this is the way that I prefer to do it. I like to lay my yarn down. You do want about a 6-inch tail hanging off your slip knot. You don't want to put your slip knot just like a tiny close to the edge right there with just a short little tail. So I'm going to lay my yarn out. I'm going to give it half a turn. So at this point, I think it looks like a fish, where here's the fish's head and here's this tail fins. Can you tell I have toddlers? And I am going to reach through that fish's head, and I'm going to grab one of the tails. You're going to grab one of the tails. I'm going to leave the long ends of the tails on the outside, and I am just going to pull. And you will know that you've done it correctly if you pull the tails here and your loop gets smaller. If you pull your tails and nothing happens, try again. So if you keep pulling, the whole knot will come out, and you'll be ready to try again. So again, I like to lay it out, give it half a turn, reach through the fish's head, leave the tails on the outside, and just pull. And once you have tied your slip knot, you are going to go ahead and place that slip knot onto your crochet hook and pull slightly. You want this loop to be very loose, almost big enough that you could get another crochet hook the same thickness through there. Your life will be so much easier when you are getting started if you make your chain and that first slip knot nice and loose. And do make sure that you leave about a 6-inch tail. You don't have to get out a tape measure or anything, although you'll have one. But you just want to make sure that that tail is not super, super short. I hope that helped you get started with your project. I am going to be showing you how to work a crochet chain today as part of our Learn to Crochet Kit. So we already have put up a getting started video that's going to talk you through tying the slip knot. You know you've done it correctly if you pull on the ends and your loop gets smaller. You are going to put that slip knot over the end of your crochet hook, and you're just going to tug until that loop gets a little bit smaller. It is incredibly important when you're doing especially your very first foundation chain in a crochet piece that you make this first chain really loose. So when you see how much space there is left around my hook, between the yarn and the hook, that's about how wide you want that loop to be. So do not pull as tight as you can so that that's really snug up against there. Leave a little bit of wiggle room in there. I say almost as much as so that you could put a second hook about the same size in there for that first chain of your project. So to get started with your chain, these are just the most basic sort of hand movements that you're going to have with crochet. You are going to take your working yarn, that means the end connected to your ball of yarn, not your short little end. If you use your short end, you'll run out of yarn really quickly. So take your working yarn and wrap it around your crochet hook. The direction that you go around the hook matters. So you want to go this direction with the yarn. And now you're going to take that loop of yarn you just laid across and you're going to pull it through the loop that was formed by our slip knot and just pull it right through there. That is one chain stitch. And again, make sure you leave a little bit of looseness there. Don't pull this first chain too tight or you will be unhappy working your first row into it. And those are the only two movements that you're doing. You're going to lay your yarn across your hook and you're going to pull it gently through. Lay your yarn across your hook and pull it gently through. Now I want to talk for a minute about exactly how I hold things. There are as many different ways to hold your work as there are people who crochet. So however it feels comfortable for you is the right answer. But this is how I do it. I do not tend to wrap my working yarn around my fingers. I know a lot of crocheters will. They'll kind of wrap things around. For me personally, that I can't even make it happen here. That just doesn't feel comfortable. I have a harder time maintaining the tension and not pulling super, super tight so that I make my fabric really tight if I wrap it around my fingers. So what I typically do is I just pinch it between my pointer finger and my middle finger and just pinch it this way. And then the rest of it just hangs down loose. I also really prefer to hold my working yarn and my fabric. So right now there's not a lot of fabric because we've only done a couple of chain stitches, but I hold my working yarn and my fabric both in my left hand, and I hold my crochet hook in my right hand. And my right hand's only job is to drive this hook. If you're trying to hold on to your fabric and your hook, you don't have quite as much control. And I will say this is tutorials designed for right-handed crocheters or lefties who choose to crochet in the right-handed style if you're ambidextrous. I will try to find some links to some good videos for any left-handed crocheters because it is a very different skill, and it's one that I am not qualified to teach because I am not any good with my left hand. So we're holding our working yarn between our two fingers with your hand, hold the fabric with your hand here, and then the right hand's only job is to drive the hook. So again, I take my yarn and I lay it across my hook. Direction matters. That way that I went is the way you want to go. And then my right hand turns my crochet hook. You'll see there's the little, actually the hook of the crochet hook sticks out a little bit more than the shaft does. And if you think about the shape of this loop that you've got on your hook, it's almost like a teardrop shape. So we want to turn the widest part of our hook so it's going through the widest part of that teardrop. And that's going to make it go through really nice and smoothly. pull that through. Wrap around, pull that through. And that is all there is to the chain in crochet. One more time, in case you haven't gotten it so far, make sure that chain is very loose. You definitely want to be able to see how you can see some light through there. It does not look too tight. That's going to make your first row of single crochet infinitely easier. If you're pulling really tight with your crochet chain, working into that chain, especially when you're just getting started, is just going to be challenging. Another thing to think about is how we count the number of crochet chain stitches that we've done. So the pattern is going to be telling you the number that you're supposed to do. It's nice, you can count while you're doing them, and it's nice once you finish to be able to double check. And so what I'm going to recommend is you go back, kind of pull up the start to make sure that slip knot, that little guy, you're not counting as one, kind of just pull that tight. And then you're just going to count, to me it looks like the letter V. Just a line of the letter V's all stacked up. Each of those letter V's counts as one. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then the loop that goes around our hook at the end does not count as one of those. So we've got 6 of those crochet chains right there. And that is how you're going to work a chain in crochet. I'm going to be showing you how to work a row of single crochets here. So this is the stitch that most people are going to start off learning with crochet. It's the shortest real stitch in crochet, and it's the most straightforward to do. It does have one downside though. It's a little bit of a stiffer fabric that it creates. It's a little bit thicker, and it does tend to not have a lot of drape to it. So generally you're not going to make full garments or full like blankets out of this stitch. Just because it is so heavy and it's going to be so firm. But it's a great stitch to get started with, and you use it a lot as components and parts of other stitches. So to get started with a row of double crochets, you are going to begin by working a turning chain. And turning chains are done the exact same way that any other chain is done. So we are going to wrap the yarn around our hook, and we are going to pull one loop through. And that is a chain 1. And for the single crochet, we are just going to work a chain 1 as our turning chain. And you may be thinking, what in the world is a turning chain, and why do I want to do it? And the reason that you need to do turning chains with crochet is because the way that crochet fabric works is your hook is at the top of the row that you're working, and you're creating fabric underneath your hook. And so when you're at the beginning of a row and your hook is right at the bottom, you can't create crocheted stitches that go straight up in the air. So you use that turning chain almost to build a little step ladder to get your hook up to the height of the row that you're going to be doing. So the pattern is going to tell you, and I will put a link in the comments of this video to the full pattern that has all of the written out instructions as well. The pattern is going to tell you to work a chain 1, and then you are going to be working your first single crochet stitch into the second stitch from your hook. So that turning chain where you build your step ladder, no matter how tall or short or what stitch you're doing, you're never going to be putting your hook back into that turning chain. So I skip that first turning chain that I just created, and I'm going to be putting my hook into that second stitch. And when I put my hook in, I'm going to start at the front of my work. So start at the front side, the right side, the side closest to your face. And you're going to take your hook and you're going to go from the front to the back. And you're going to go under 2 strands there. I think it looks like the letter V. And if you look at the top all the way along, you'll see those letter V's all the way along. So you put your hook through your fabric. So at this point you have the loop you started with and then the 2 legs of the V right there. You are going to lay the yarn across your hook and come back under the 2 legs of the V, but not that first loop. So you've got 2 loops here. You're going to lay your yarn across a second time, and you're going to pull through both of those loops that remain. And then you're going to do that exact same thing. You only skip that turning chain once at the very beginning of the row. From here on out, you're just doing 1 single crochet in each stitch across. So when I go to look at to put my hook in for the next stitch, when you're looking this way, you can kind of see this is where my first stitch is. We want to put our hook into that very, very next stitch. And if you want to see those letter V's that I was talking about, you almost need to turn your work towards you a little bit to be able to see those V's. So some people find it easy enough to get your hook through looking at it from the side. Some people prefer to turn it so they really are looking from the top and seeing that V. Whichever way works better for you is fine. So we put our hook here, we lay our yarn across, we come under one strand, we wrap the yarn around again, we come under 2 strands. And we are simply going to do that all the way across to create our row of single crochets. And that is how we work the most basic stitch in crochet. I'm going to show you now how to work the double crochet stitch. I'll show you the close-up of that here. The double crochet stitch is about twice as tall as the single crochet, which is probably the most basic of the crochet stitches. And the double crochet stitch tends to get used the most. It's going to create a fabric that's nice and drapey, so it's not going to be really stiff. And it's going to grow pretty quickly. If you're making a project with a double crochet, that you're going to get your scarf to add some length to it pretty quick. So the double crochet is probably the most often used crochet stitch. And it is pretty straightforward to work. So I'm going to show you how to work a double crochet. So in order to get started, you again, just like we learned with the single crochet on our last square of this sampler scarf. And I will put a link to the full pattern in the comment section. So all of this is written down in a pattern. But you are always, just like in the first row that we did, or the first block that we did with the single crochet, you're always, assuming that you are a right-handed crocheter, you are always going to be starting on the right side of your piece and working to the left. So you crochet the opposite way that you read a book. And we are going to begin the double crochet row by working a turning chain. And a turning chain is worked identically to every other way that you would create a chain stitch. So we are going to wrap the yarn around our hook one time, and we are going to pull that wrap through the loop that was already on our hook. And that created one chain stitch. Now we are going to, our pattern is telling us to, we are going to be making 3 chain stitches. These chain stitches are creating almost like a step stool to the top of the row that we are going to be creating. So the way that crochet fabric works, our crochet hook is always at the top of our row, and we're creating fabric underneath where our hook is. So when you first get started on a row, your hook is at the bottom. You can't make crochet stitches up into the air. We need to build our little turning chain ladder to get up to the height of the row so that we're able to make our crochet stitches underneath our hook. So the pattern tells us to work a chain 3. We've worked our chain 3, and now we are going to be working a double crochet. Before we insert our hook, we are going to wrap the yarn one time around the hook. And I say wrap, you're not even going all the way around. You're kind of going up and over. The same direction that you would wrap your yarn when you were doing a chain, or that we wrapped when we were working the single crochet. You're always wrapping that yarn the same direction. And now we need to figure out where we are going to put our hook. You are never, no matter what crochet stitch you're working, you're never going to put your hook into the turning chains. So we just worked a chain 3, 1, 2, 3. We're never going to be putting our hook back into any of those 3. That's our step ladder. We don't want to mess with that. That stays exactly where it is. With the double crochet, we also skip the very first actual stitch. So we skipped the chain 3, we skipped the 4th, and so we're going to be putting our hook into that 5th stitch away. And just like with the single crochet, we want to make sure, I think it looks like the letter V kind of on its side there, the letter V, the letter V, the letter V, all the way down. When we put our hook in, we want to make sure we are going under both legs of that letter V. So you have 2 strands of yarn on your hook there, and they're smushed right next to each other. So it almost looks like one strand of yarn, but there's 2 in there. You can see them separated apart there. And so we have the loop that we started with. We have the strand of yarn that we wrapped across our hook, and then we have the 2 legs of that V where we just put our hook in. And now we are going to lay the yarn across our hook and come under the first 2 strands, the 2 legs of that V where we just inserted our hook. And now we have 3 loops on our hook now. We are going to lay the yarn across again, and we're going to go under 2 strings. There's 3 on here, we're only going under 2 of them. So this one here, the one farthest away from the hook, is staying put. We're going to go under 2 strings, so now we have 2 loops on our hook. We're going to lay the yarn across one more time, and we're going to go under those 2 strings. And that's a double crochet. So you can see how our chain 3 it looks very similar to the double crochet. It's the same height. It looks similar. If you look super close, they are a little bit different. But this pattern, and pretty much any other crochet pattern that you're going to find, is going to tell you that that chain 3 counts as a double crochet. So when we get to the end of this row, our pattern is going to tell us we should have 15 double crochets. That is going to be including this. So you'll count this as if it were 1 double crochet. So I'm going to show you how to do one more of those stitches. We are only skipping things at the very beginning of the row. We're not going to skip it from here on out. So I put my first double crochet right here. My second double crochet is going to go right next door, immediately right there. So before I put my hook into my fabric, I'm going to lay my yarn across. I'm going to put my hook in. Again, make sure you're getting under both legs of that letter V. Lay the yarn across, come under 2 strings. Lay the yarn across, come under 2 strings. Lay the yarn across, come under the last 2 strings. And that is a double crochet. I'm going to go ahead and double crochet across to the end of this row, because there is one tricky thing that happens right at the end of a row of double crochet that I think is worth making sure to point out. And you will get to the point where it goes this smoothly and quickly. I have been crocheting since I was 8 years old, and I am now much older than 8 years old. So I've had a lot of years to get very comfortable with the crochet stitch. Don't feel frustrated if yours doesn't go quite this smoothly. You will get there eventually. As long as you're having fun, you're doing it right. I do kind of want to point out how I hold my working yarn. The working yarn is just the end that's connected to your ball of yarn. A lot of people will wrap this around their fingers different ways. For me personally, that does not feel comfortable, and so I don't do it. My working yarn goes between my 2 fingers and over the top of my pointer finger, and that is all I do in terms of tensioning my working yarn. However, it feels comfortable for you to hold your yarn. If that is to wrap it around every finger you've got 5 times, great. As long as that feels comfortable for you to work, that is the right way for you to do it. But if you can't get it to feel right doing that, then you do not have to, you don't have to put that yarn under tension in any fancy way at all. Again, I just loop it across just that one time, and it's not connected to anything else. So when you get to the very end of your row with double crochets, every one of those letter V's where you're putting your hook is laid out all nice and neat and tidy, and they all look exactly the same as each other, all the way to the end. And you just put your hook in every one exactly the same as the one before, until your very last stitch. The very last stitch that you do, you are actually going to be putting your hook into what was our 3rd chain from the previous row. So at the beginning of the row, we do a chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and then at the end of the row, we are going to be putting our hook into that 3rd chain that we did the last time we did this row. And this does not look at all like any of the other letter V's, and it's kind of tight to try to get your hook in there. I always call this my swearing stitch. If you get to the end of the row and you have not wanted to swear yet, you're probably not done. You probably have one more stitch to do. And so you're going to come right here, and we do want to ideally get under 2 strings. They're not going to look neat and tidy like a V like the other one. but there are 2 strands there, and then there is 1 strand underneath. You don't really want to put your hook in the big giant hole. You do want to try to get it through those 2 strands. And now we're going to work that exactly like every other double crochet. Lay the yarn across, come under the 2 strands, yarn across, under the 2 strands, yarn across, under the last 2 strands. And that will keep your edges nice and neat and tidy. And if you wonder why you need to do that, do you remember at the beginning of the row we skipped all 3 turning chains and that first stitch? Since we skipped one at the beginning, we need to put that extra one out there on the end. If you don't do that, if you go into this one and you don't go into the last one, your piece is going to start to become a bit of a rhombus. It's going to grow this way and it's going to shrink on the other side. So this will keep your edges nice and neat and tidy. And that's how you work a row of double crochet. I'm going to be talking through how to work a half double crochet right now. So the first thing we are going to look at is kind of see what a half double crochet looks like. So a half double crochet is halfway in between the height of a single crochet, which is quite a short little stitch. So this is all single crochets. And then this is a full double crochet. It's quite a bit taller than a single crochet. The half double crochet is right in between those 2. So this is a half double crochet. It's taller than a single and shorter than a double. And so you can see the double crochets right here and then transitioning into that half double. So this is a row of double crochets, and then this is a row of half double crochets. So you can see how they're shorter, but they're not as short as a single crochet, which I can pop up here for comparison. The single crochet is going to be quite a bit shorter than the half double. So that's what the half double crochet looks like. Now I will show you how to work a half double crochet. And all of the half stitches, so this is a half double, but all of the half stitches, there's a half treble crochet, there's a half double treble crochet, all of the half stitches are going to follow the exact same pattern that the half double crochet follows. So, and the pattern will give you all of this information. I will put a link to the pattern for this sampler scarf that includes a lot of different crochet stitches. I'll put the link to that pattern in the comments here, and the pattern will give you the full written out directions as well. But to get started, you are going to work a turning chain of 2 stitches. So the chain, you're just going to lay the yarn across and pull it through. That's 1. And do that same thing again. So a turning chain of 2, and then for the half double you are going to skip. You always skip no matter what stitch you're doing. You always skip the turning chain, so we're not going to put our hook into either of the first 2 chains that we did. And then for the half double we are also going to skip the first stitch that's actually there. So we are going to be putting our crochet hook into the 4th stitch from our hook. We skip 1, 2, 3, and we're going into the 4th one. And to do the half double, we are going to set up like we were doing a full double crochet. We're going to wrap the yarn around our hook one time, and we're going to put it in to our fabric. When you are putting your hook in, you do want to go under both legs of that letter V from the previous row. And you're going to lay the yarn across one time. You're going to pull it back under those 2 legs of the V where you put your hook. You've got 3 loops on your hook right now. We are going to lay our yarn across, and we're going to come through all 3 loops so that we have just 1 loop on our hook again. And you are going to repeat that across. So I set up like I'm doing the full stitch. So I'm doing a half double. I set up like I'm doing the entire double crochet. I lay the yarn around my hook. I insert my hook through, wrap the yarn under 2 strings, wrap the yarn, we go under 3 strings. And then move on to the next one. Wrap the yarn, insert the hook, we go under the 2 strings, wrap the yarn, go under the 3 strings. And so the pattern that every half stitch, so if your pattern is suddenly calling for a half treble crochet and you think, I've never done that before, I don't know how to do that, all of the half stitches are going to follow that same pattern. You are going to do your setup, do the number of wraps around your hook that you would normally do for the full stitch, and then you are going to work all but the last 2 steps. And generally, so if you were doing a double crochet, you'd go under 2 strings, wrap the yarn around, and then go under the last 2. For the half double and any of the half stitches, you're going to go under the strings until you get to the point where you have 3 loops left, and you're going to lay your yarn across and go under all 3. So if you were to want to do a half treble crochet, a full treble crochet, you would wrap the yarn around 2 times. You would go under 2 strings, under 2 strings, and you would go under 2 strings and under 2 more. But the half treble, you go under 2 strings until you have 3 strings left, and then you go under all 3. So that is how that pattern is going to work. We're not doing a half treble, so I'm just going to go ahead and take that out. But I think it is interesting to understand how crochet stitches all sort of logically make sense and they all build on each other. So if you're ever seeing an abbreviation or a pattern is telling you to do a stitch that you have not ever done before, you're not suddenly thrown off and think that you really are not going to be able to do that. And you will see at the very end here, I've just gone through the last stitch that was easy to spot, and just like the double crochet, you are going to put your hook into, you're actually working on the turning chain from the row below. So we did our chain 1 and chain 2 here. I am going to be putting my hook into that top turning chain and working my final half double crochet into that turning chain. And that is going to allow me to make sure that my edges are straight. And I said that, and I was describing something that wasn't actually what I was doing. So I went through all of my stitches here, and I actually had not, the stitch that I just showed you was the last standard stitch, and I'm now going to go into the last stitch. And you can see, if you look at this, you can see how that edge is not going to be straight. If I stop here, I've kind of got a stair step down. So you can always kind of visually look at your piece and see. And so that is the last stitch of my turning chain. And pull through. And now I'm going to have a nice square edge. And if you are right at the end of your row and you can't decide, like I just had a hard time doing, if you have 1 stitch remaining or not, you can go back and count your stitches across the row. You want to have 15 stitches across this row, including that chain 2 that you did at the beginning. So if I just count, I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15. So I know that I have completed my row, but I have not done an extra stitch. And then you're ready to just begin your next row. You're going to turn your work. You're going to work your chain 2. You are going to skip those 2 chains and the first actual stitch, and you're going to put your hook right there to work half double crochets all the way across to the other end. And that's how you do a half double. I am going to be showing you how to work this fairly basic crochet stitch, sometimes called the moss stitch, sometimes called the linen stitch or the granite stitch. And it's basically a mesh made with a single crochet and a chain 1 next to it. It creates this nice open fabric, but it's not so open as you would get if you were doing more like a double crochet mesh. And I think it's a good way to practice reading some of your stitches in crochet, which is something that just takes some practice to get good at. So let me show you how to work this stitch. So the full pattern for this sampler scarf is, I'm going to put that in the comments of all of these videos so you can get the full pattern, and the written out pattern will have all of your instructions on it as well. But the pattern is going to tell us to begin by working a chain 2. So we are just going to do 2 chain stitches, and then work a single crochet into the chain 1 space from the row below. So the first thing you need to do is find the chain 1 space from the row below. So you can see this is a single crochet. You can kind of see that almost looks like a letter V right there, the two sticks that form the shaft of the single crochet. There's one there, and there's one right there. And this little hole that's between them was formed by working a chain 1 in the previous row. So when the pattern is telling me to do something into that chain 1 space, that's what it's talking about. And you can see those chain 1 spaces all the way down across this row. So there's one there, there's one there, there's one there. And you can see it between one single crochet and the second single crochet. So we chained 2, and then we are going to work a single crochet into the chain 1 space. So I'm going to work a single crochet right there. And to do a single crochet, we insert our crochet hook, and the pattern is actually saying into the chain 1 space. That means go into the big hole created by working the chain 1, as opposed to working into the chain 1 would mean we were actually putting our hook into just the chain itself. And you can see there is another little strand under there. So that would be working into the chain 1. The pattern tells us to work into the chain 1 space. So that means we're going to put our hook into the big hole. It's really easy to get your hook in there, so that part's kind of nice. So we work a single crochet into the chain 1 space. So I insert my hook, I lay my yarn across, I go under the whole fabric that I've got there, I wrap my yarn across, and I come under those 2 strings as well. And the pattern is now going to tell me, I'm just moving the rest of my scarf out of the way here. The pattern is now going to tell me to do a chain 1. And chain 1s are easy to do because we don't have to put our hook in anywhere. We are just going to lay the yarn across and pull it through one time to work a chain 1. And I am going to do that all the way across. The pattern is saying do that 7 times across your row. So I just finished a chain 1. I am going to do a single crochet into the chain 1 space from the row below. And repeat. Chain 1, work a single crochet into that chain 1 space from the previous row. Chain 1, work a single into the chain 1 space. Chain 1, work a single into the chain 1 space. Chain 1, work a single into the chain 1 space. I'm going to repeat that all the way to, the pattern is saying repeat that 7 times. It is very important when you're following a crochet pattern, especially when it's telling you to repeat something, that you know what is at the beginning of the repeat and what is at the end of your repeat. Because if it's telling you to work it 7 times, you want to make sure that you complete the 7th time and you don't sort of stop in the middle. So what the pattern is telling me to repeat is inside parentheses, and it says work a single crochet into the chain 1 space and then chain 1. So that means when you're repeating it 7 times, you need to make sure that you complete that last chain 1. If you forget that part and you do just your single crochet, your pattern's going to be off. It's not going to work the way that you want it to work. So do make sure anytime it's telling you to repeat that you know exactly when you are finished repeating. So I've repeated that 7 times across. I finished the entire repeat. I did my last chain 1. And now I'm going to do a single crochet into the last chain 1 space. So that's this one right here. I'm going to work a single crochet right into that last one. And then it is saying do a single crochet into the 2nd stitch from the row below. And so this time, this was the chain 1 that I did at the beginning of the previous row, and this was the chain 2. The pattern wants me to put a single crochet right there. The pattern does not want me to do another chain 1 to separate these. So I've been doing single crochet, chain, single crochet, chain. This time I did a single crochet. I'm not going to chain. I am just going to work a 2nd single crochet right there. And now we are going to begin at the beginning of that row again. So I turn my work, so I'm getting ready to start the next row. The pattern is telling me to chain 2. And then importantly, the pattern, and you're just repeating that one row over and over again. The first line of the pattern is chain 2, and then work a single crochet into the chain 1 space. You can see here, I have 2 single crochets right next to each other. The pattern does not want me to put my single crochet in between those 2 because it wants me to find the chain 1 space. So if you get excited and you put a single crochet in between these 2 that don't have a space in between them, instead of your piece being a rectangle that has straight edges, you're going to find that your piece is growing. It becomes kind of a triangle. It gets bigger and bigger because you're adding a stitch at the beginning of every row. So do make sure it wants you to go into the chain 1 space that's right here. It doesn't want you to go in between those 2 that don't have a chain 1 in between them. And you're just going to do that exact same thing again. So work a single crochet into that chain 1 space. And you're going to keep doing that until your piece is square. I'm going to be showing you how to work the cluster stitch that you see right here in this stitch pattern panel from the Learn to Crochet Sampler Scarf, and I will put a link to the entirety of the pattern in the comment section so you can get that full pattern if you decide you'd like to. So to work this particular pattern, I showed you the block that had it completed, and now I'm going to show you how to actually work that stitch. So this is done by creating clusters, little clumps, of a double crochet 3 stitches together. So you'll kind of see that there's almost like 3 individual stitches there, but they originate from one spot and then they end up in one spot. So to do that, you are going to begin by chaining 3 because these are a set of double crochets, so you're going to do your turning chain of 3, and then you are going to work that set of a double crochet 3 together into the chain 1 that was between the 2 puff stitches from the previous row. So you do a puff stitch, a chain 1, and a puff stitch, or a cluster stitch. And I'm going to be putting my hook into that chain 1 in between those 2 clusters from the row below. So I'm going to put my hook into 1 stitch, and this is working a double crochet 3 together. So I set up like I'm doing a double crochet. I'm going to do the first 2 steps of a double crochet exactly as normal, but I am not going to complete that 3rd step. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to work the first 2 steps of a second double crochet. So I wrap my yarn around, I put my hook through that exact same spot where I went the last time, and I'm going to complete the first 2 steps of a second double crochet stitch. You'll notice I now have 3 loops on my hook. So you normally have 1 loop. I worked the first 2 steps but did not complete the first double crochet, and so I have a second loop from that. And then I completed the first 2 steps but not the 3rd step for a second double crochet, and I have the loop from that. I'm now going to wrap my yarn around my hook 1 time and put it in that exact same spot again and complete the first 2 steps of a 3rd double crochet. And now I have 4 loops on my hook. And I'm now going to wrap my yarn around, and I'm going to bring it through all 4 loops on my hook. And then my pattern tells me to chain 1, so I'm going to chain 1. So that creates that little cluster. My pattern now tells me to work another cluster into the chain 1 between the 2 clusters from the row below. So I'm going to continue to do that all the way across. So one more time, I wrap my yarn around my hook. I'm going into the chain 1 between the 2 clusters from the row below. So I'm putting my hook into my fabric. I'm doing the first 2 steps of a double crochet. Now I have 2 loops on my hook. Wrap my yarn around, go in that exact same spot, do the first 2 steps of a second double crochet, wrap my yarn around my hook, and do the first 2 steps of a 3rd double crochet. And you should have 4 loops on your hook. Wrap the yarn around your hook and pull it through all 4 loops. And then do a chain 1. You're going to do that all the way across. You're going to work between each of the clusters that happened in the previous row. You are going to work 1 final cluster on the other side of the cluster from the previous row, and then you're going to do a double crochet into the third chain of the chain 3 from the previous row, and that's going to create these nice even edges that you've got there, and that's how you're going to work the cluster fabric. I'm going to be showing you right now how to work the V stitch in crochet. So this is the section of the sampler scarf that I've already got made up that utilizes this V stitch. So you'll see it looks like the letter V all stacked up in a line. It makes a really pretty pattern. It's a little bit open, but it's not quite as open as like a meshy pattern would be. So I think it holds its shape a little bit better, especially in something like this where you're doing it as a panel. You don't want this section to be super floppy against the rest of it that's a little bit more substantial. And so I'm going to be showing you how to actually work that stitch right now. And again, the written instructions and the full pattern are for sale as our beginning crochet pattern, and I will put a link to where you can get the copy of that in the comment section here. But the pattern is going to tell you that you are going to start by working a chain 3. This is going to act as a double crochet, and then into the 4th stitch from the chain, or from your hook. So you're going to skip the chain 3s that you just did and the 1st stitch that's already there. You are going to work a double crochet, a standard double crochet, and then you are going to chain 1. And then you are going to work a double crochet into that exact same spot. And that creates a V, where you've got the 2 double crochets have the same base point, and there's a chain 1 in between. So that creates your V stitch. And then you're going to skip 2 stitches. So skip 1, 2, and you're going to do that same V stitch into that 3rd stitch away. So we wrap our yarn around, we're working a standard double crochet, a chain 1, and then again into that exact same spot, another double crochet. And that makes another V stitch. And you're going to repeat that across. So I skip 2, 1, 2, and I put another V stitch into this 3rd one here. So a double crochet, a chain 1, a double crochet, skip 2, 1, 2, working right here, a double crochet, a chain 1 into that same spot, a double crochet, skip 2 into this one here, the last standard V stitch, chain 1, double crochet, and the pattern tells me that I should have 5 V stitches across. For me personally, anytime a pattern is giving me a little clue like that, I like to go and count and see if I have the number that the pattern told me that I'm supposed to have. So this was our chain 3 at the beginning, so that's not one of the V's. The pattern says I should have 5 V's, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I've got 5 V's. I've done it the way the pattern wanted me to. The last step of the pattern is to do a double crochet into the top of the chain 3 from the row below. So it's going to be this guy right here. I'm just going to do a double crochet into that one. And that is what's going to keep my edges nice and straight. So that was the first row of the V stitch when I'm working not into an existing row of the V stitch. But from here on out, every row that I'm going to put of the V stitch beyond this point, I'm going to actually be working on top of other V's. And so we're going to do the same thing, but where we put our hook is going to be explained in the pattern just a little bit differently. So the next row of the pattern is telling me to chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and then it's telling me to work into the center of the V from the last row. So here's my V from the last row, and so I'm going to be putting a V into the center of the V from the last row. So that to put a V into it, I'm going to be doing a double crochet, a chain 1, and a double crochet, and to work into the center of the V, I'm going to go right here. So I'm going to put my hook in, and I'm not trying to get through any of this fabric. I'm actually going in the hole that's created in the center of the V. So it's nice and easy to put my hook right through there. And I'm going to do a double crochet, a chain one, and then I'm going to go into that exact same, the big hole, not trying to get into any of the fabric pieces, just going right into that big hole. And then the next place that I'm going to be going is into the center of the next V. So I'm going to be putting my hook there for the next one. So I'm just putting the letter V on top of a letter V. And that is going to create my V-stitch fabric on my sampler scarf here. I am going to be talking you through how to create this ribbed effect in crochet. So this is for our sampler scarf with our Learn to Crochet kit, and I will put the link to the full pattern in the comments section. But I'm just going to talk through kind of how to get this, and it is done with a combination of crocheting through the front post and back post, and that's how you're going to get this textural difference here. And so this is what the completed picture is going to look like, and I want to show you how we achieve that. So you are going to begin on a row of 15 double crochets. So you're going to put your 15 double crochets against whatever the last pattern that you did was, or if this is on a different project, you're just going to begin by working a row of double crochets. And we are then going to do a chain of 2. Now you may be thinking normally when we're working double crochets we are going to chain 3 stitches, so why only 2 this time? And the reason for that will become apparent as I keep going. So we're going to chain our 2, and that is going to act as a double crochet for this row. And then we are going to work 2 additional back post double crochets. So to do a back post, we are going to position our crochet hook at the back of our work. We are going to come to the front of our work, and then we are going to return to the back of our work. And we are going to wrap our yarn around and come through, and then work just as a totally standard double crochet at that point. So that was a back post double crochet. That was one of those. And now I'm going to do the second one of those. And so again, you wrap the yarn around like you're doing a double crochet. You begin with your hook in the back of your work. You come to the front of your work, and you return to the back of your work. Wrap the yarn around and complete your standard double crochet. And now when I talked about why do we do a chain of 2 instead of the more standard chain of 3 when you're working with double crochets, and the reason for that is because these back post and front post double crochets set down farther into the row that came before them than standard, and so they're shorter than a standard double crochet. So if you do a chain 3 here, the very first stitch of your row is going to be too tall, and you're going to end up with a little bit of a flare out right at the edge. So that's why it's a chain 2. So that counts as our first one. We've done 2 more, so we've kind of got a set of 3 back post there. And now we are going to do 3 front post. So I wrap my yarn around my hook, so 3 front post double crochets. Wrap the yarn to do a double crochet. Front post, we begin with our hook in the front, we put it to the back, and then we return it to the front. We are going to then do a normal double crochet. So wrap our yarn around, come through the fabric that we put our hook through, wrap around, come through 2, wrap around, come through 2. So that was 1. We're going to do a second one and a third one. And we are just going to alternate. We're going to now do 3 back post double crochets. So we start with a hook in the back, come to the front, return it to the back. 1, 2, 3 steps, and work 3 of the back post, and then it's time for 3 front post. Start at the front, go to the back, return to the front, and again just a standard double crochet for 3 of those. And then the pattern is telling us to do the last 3 double crochets as back post, And you always know you're on the right track with reading a pattern. If the pattern tells you to do 3 more of something and there are 3 more stitches there, that's just a handy way to know that you are in fact doing, you've counted correctly. You haven't lost count or done an extra one or left one out along the way. And so those are our 3 back posts. And so the very, very last one is actually our turning chain from the row below. We're going to treat it as if it's a stitch. It feels a little bit awkward to go around when you've just got that last stitch on the row, but treat it just like all of the other ones. And then you can look and see, is this visually looking the way that it's supposed to look? So you can see you've got a clump of 3 there that look one way, and a clump of 3 here that look differently. So the front post stitches poke out towards you. The fabric actually punches out towards you, and then the back post kind of sinks away from you a little bit. So you have 3 back, 3 front, 3 back, 3 front, 3 back. So that is one row of the pattern. The other row of the pattern, so when I flip, I just completed 3 back post double crochets. When I flip my fabric over to begin my next row, you'll notice when I look at these, suddenly these look like front posts. They're poking out towards us, and this is because I'm looking at the back side of what I just did. And so we are going to begin the next row by do our chain 3, and then we are going to be working 2 front posts on top of here. So on one row, when we're going one direction, we start and end with back posts, and then on the next way, we are going to start and end with front posts. And we're just going to alternate between those 2 rows until we have our square piece here. I hope that helped. I'm going to be going over how to work the crocodile stitch in crochet, as our sampler scarf uses that stitch for the middle section here. So this stitch is a very, very heavily textured stitch. As you can see, I've already done a couple of rows of this so you guys could get a sense of what this was going to look like. And it's fun to do once you get the hang of it. It really does go pretty quickly, and it makes a real statement piece. And it's got those kind of scales like a crocodile, or sometimes they're called dragon scales as well. So this stitch is worked as kind of a 2-row deal. The first row, you're building the scaffolding that you're going to be putting the textured stitches on, and then the second row, you're actually going back and putting those textured stitching in onto that scaffolding that you've built. So the first row, you are going to be building your scaffolding, and I do have the full pattern instructions written out, and they are on the Learn to Crochet Kit, and I will put a link to that in the comments of this video and this playlist. So you don't just have to remember this, but hopefully this will give you some good tips as well. So the instructions are telling you to chain 3, so we're going to do a regular chain 3, and then to work another double crochet into the 4th stitch from our hook. So we're skipping the chain 3, and we're going to skip that first stitch, and we're going to go, and because you've done some slip stitches in the row below, there is a little bit of an art to finding where you're going to put that hook for the next one. Then you're doing a second double crochet there, so you have a cluster of 2 double crochets. Then you're going to chain 1, and then you are going to do, the pattern is telling you to do a double crochet into the center of the scale from the row below. So here's our scale from the row below, and here's the center of that scale. And so I'm going to do a double crochet right there into the center, and then chain 1. And then the pattern is telling me to do 2 double crochets in the place where the 2 scales meet. So here's one scale, here's the second scale, and here's the spot where those 2 meet. So again, a little bit of an art form. You're going to put your hook in where those meet, and you're going to work 2 double crochets. Oops. So there's the first one, and when I work the second one, I'm just going into that exact same spot where I went on the last row, or on the last double crochet. And so we've got a clump of 2 double crochets, a gap, 1 double crochet, a gap, 2 double crochets, we're going to chain 1, and we're going to do 1 double crochet into the space in the center of the scale from the row below. Chain 1, we're going to work 2 double crochets where those 2 scales from the row below meet. One right here, and the pattern does tell you when you're working your very first row you don't have the same reference points of the scales from the row below, so the pattern does tell you where to go just into your chain to make that happen. A double crochet into the center of that, and then we've got the last set of 2 double crochets. We're going just on the edge there. So again, a little bit of an art form, just kind of pick the spot that looks like it makes sense to go into. And as long as you're in the general area, it is going to work out just fine. Again, this is just the scaffolding, so you're not actually going to see these stitches at all. So you can see as I've gone across the back, I've got a clump of 2, space 1, space 2, space 1, space 2, space 1, space 2. All the way across. And I have labeled these in the instructions as stitch A, B, C, D, E, F. That way when I'm referring to them as you're building on this scaffolding, it's really easy to know where you're supposed to be going. So what we are going to be doing now is we are going to begin by working around stitch B. So this is stitch A, this is stitch B, it's that second one. And we are going to work 5 back post double crochets around stitch B, and we're going to start at the top and work down to the bottom. So I'm doing a double crochet, so I wrap the yarn around my hook. I'm doing a back post double crochet, so I take my hook and I go from the front where it is to the back, and then I return to the front. I'm going to wrap my yarn around, and I'm just going to work a double crochet. So I go under that first strand, I wrap the yarn around, I come under 2 strands, I wrap my yarn around, and I come under the last 2 strands. So that's a back post double crochet, and I'm going to do a total of 5 of those, working from the top to the bottom. So my second one, I wrap my yarn around my hook, I put my hook, I start on the right hand side, I go from the front where I am now to the back, and then I return to the front. Wrap my yarn around, I come underneath, wrap my yarn around, come under 2 stitches, wrap my yarn around, come under 2 stitches. So those are back post double crochets, and I'm going to do 5 of them. And I will see if I can count to 5 and talk at the same time. These are creating kind of the downstroke of the scales. This is creating, and I'll show you, that should have been 5. You can see what this looks like. So what we are creating is this part of the scale. And so you can see that when I look here, we've got that down swing of the scale. So we've got our 5, and you can go back in and count if you forget. If you've done 5, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So once we've completed 5, we are now, that was stitch B of our scaffolding. The next one along is stitch C. We are going to be working 5 back post double crochets around this stitch, and that's going to form the upswing of the scale. These are going to be a little bit different in that these are reverse back post double crochets. So a standard back post, you start from the right hand side and you move to the left. These, you're going to start from the left hand side and move to the right. And these, we're going from the bottom to the top. So I've put my hook in, I wrap my yarn around, I'm doing just a regular double crochet at this point. That was 1 reverse back stitch double crochet from the bottom to the top. So I'm getting ready for my next one. I wrap my yarn around my hook and I go the weird way. It's going to feel kind of awkward if you are a right-handed crocheter, but we are going to begin on the left-hand side and go put our hook through to the right hand side. Wrap the yarn around, come under, under, and under. And we are doing 5 of those, and again working from the bottom to the top. So every time I go in, I'm going above the stitch that I had previously made. And we are going to do those 5, and that brings me up to the top of the scale. And so you can see I did 5 that brought me down to the bottom of the scale and 5 that brought me back up to the top of the scale. And then our pattern is going to tell us, so we skipped on our scaffolding stitches in the back. We skipped stitch A, we worked our down, our top to bottom double crochets on stitch B, we worked our bottom to top stitches on stitch C, and now we are going to slip stitch on top of stitch D. So I'm going to put my hook here, I'm going to wrap my yarn around, and I'm working a slip stitch. So I pull my hook through every loop on it. There we go. And now I'm ready to do the same thing. I'm going to do 5 back post double crochets from top to bottom down this side, and then 5 reverse back post double crochets from bottom to top on this side. And then I'm going to slip stitch there to tack down the other side of that scale. And that is how we work the scales. You will notice, and the pattern walks you through the specifics of this a little bit more, but they are offset just a little bit. So our first row of scales, you are beginning in that second stitch of the scaffolding, and that puts the stitches, they overhang slightly on this side. And then the next time we build our scaffolding coming back this way, the next time we start in the third stitch from the beginning, and that shifts so that the scale is offset just a little bit and it overhangs a little bit on this side. And that gives it a little bit more of a scaly appearance. But that is how you are going to work the crocodile stitch for this pattern. Once you have finished the very last block of your sampler scarf here, the question naturally becomes, how do I finish the project so that I get to wear the piece that I've worked so hard on? So I am going to be showing you how to fasten off the end of a crochet project and then how to weave your ends in. So when you get to the end of the piece and you're ready to be finished with it, the first thing that I would recommend doing is go ahead and use your crochet hook to make that loop bigger. Just tug on it a little bit to make that last loop bigger. Now I do this when I am finished working on any part. If I'm just going to set my project down for a few minutes or for the evening, I go ahead and pull that loop a little bit bigger, just so that if I accidentally tug and pull on this end, I'm not unraveling my hard work. But it makes the next step a little bit easier if you go ahead and pull that loop a little bit bigger before you finish off. Then you're going to want to just go ahead and snip your yarn. Scissors or the little yarn snips that will come in the beginning crochet kit from us are going to work just fine for that. And you do want to leave about a 6-inch tail of yarn here. You don't want to make it a tiny short little tail because that will make weaving it in just a little bit more challenging. So you've made that bigger loop, you've snipped your yarn, you're now going to pass the tail of the yarn that you just cut through that loop, and right to left to right, doesn't matter. Just put it through there. Once it's passed through, go ahead and pull on that tail, and that tightens it down. And you have secured the edge of your crochet, so nothing is going to unravel now. That's fastening it off right there. And the next thing that you want to do is weave in your ends. I prefer to do this with a tapestry needle. That is just a needle that doesn't have a particularly pointy end and has an eye big enough to put your yarn through. But you could certainly do the same thing with a crochet hook if you don't have a tapestry needle handy. So you are going to thread your yarn through that tapestry needle. And I generally would use a tapestry needle with a slightly bigger eye for this worsted weight yarn, but you can get it through there. And you are going to, I generally like to take my tail and weave it about 1.5 inches in one direction and then come back about half that distance in the other direction. It's not an exact science. I like to go through the middle of the stitches instead of kind of all the way through to the other side and back again. I just think that hides it more and makes it look a little bit nicer. So I kind of go through the middle of the stitch. You can see you don't see the needle from the other side. So I've gone kind of halfway in the middle of the stitch. And I'm just going to run my tapestry needle along. And again, a little bit more of an art than an exact science, kind of the length of the needle itself, or about 1.5 inches. And then just pull that tail through. Pull that through. And you do want to tug on that so that you don't have, your fabric is not puckered up like this. You want to tug so that it all lays nice and flat and has a little bit of give to it. And then I like to turn around and come back the other direction. Do make sure you don't put your tapestry needle in exactly where you came out of, or you will unlace the weaving in that you just did. So make sure your tapestry needle is going in a little bit of a different spot. So I prefer to go through kind of the next row down. And again, like halfway through the stitch so your needle's not poking out the other side. So you can see that the tapestry needle doesn't come all the way through the other side. And you're just going to pull that. And again, I go about halfway back again. Pull that across. I pulled my tapestry needle off the end there. Give it another tug and pull to make sure that nothing is cinched up. And then you can go ahead and trim that flush with your work. And you have woven in the end. And obviously you will have an end at the other side of your piece as well. Where you began, you're going to do that exact same thing on the other side. And that is how you fasten off and weave in the ends on your first project. I'm going to be talking right now about blocking your first crochet project or your 21st crochet project if you've been doing this for a long time already. So blocking is what you do when you're completely finished with your work. And it is going to help even out any inconsistencies in your stitches. So this is a sampler scarf, and I will put the link in the comments to the full pattern for how to work this sampler scarf. But your blocking is going to even out any stitch idiosyncrasies that you might have, especially in just some of your basic stitches. It's going to help the curling edges that you get right on the edges there where things kind of flop over a little bit. It's going to help if you have some stitches that pull in. So you'll notice the ribbing stitch here, it looks like this part of the scarf gets a little bit narrower than the parts on either side of it, and that has to do with how that particular stitch pattern pulls in compared to the stitches around it. Blocking is going to help all of those things just lay a little bit nicer and work a little bit better. And it is something that I know is intimidating to a lot of people, so I just like to do a video every time I finish a project so you can see how I like to do that. So I have my highly technical piece of equipment here of a bucket full of warm water. I use water that's just tap warm, so I run it as hot as it comes out of our tap, and I normally do this in our kitchen sink, but it's harder to take a video there. So I've done it in a bucket here in the video studio instead. So you're going to fill that up with warm water, and you're just going to take your completed piece and you're going to drop it in the water. And you want to make sure that that is fully submerged. So put it all the way underneath the water. You can move it around just a little bit. This happens to be a superwash wool, so we're not at all concerned about it felting, but even if it wasn't, that amount of agitation that you just saw me do is not going to felt anything. That is going to work just fine for you. So you leave it submerged and wait a couple of minutes while it sits in the water so that it can absorb all of the water and get all the way deep into the fabric. While I'm waiting for it to sit for just a minute or two, I'm going to talk about if you have watched my blocking videos for knitted pieces, you'll notice I normally recommend for knitting that you do not weave your ends in because when you block knitting, your fabric tends to stretch and grow quite a bit, and you don't want to have woven your ends in and have those ends then be puckered tight as your fabric grows around them. Crochet fabric doesn't grow in the same way that knitting fabric does when you are when you are blocking it. So you can go ahead and weave those ends, and I know most people prefer to go ahead and weave their ends in right away. So once it's sat for a few minutes, and it really, 5 minutes is fine. If you forget it and it stays out overnight soaking, that's okay too. It's not going to hurt it. So anywhere from 5 minutes to 24 hours, whatever works for you. And then you're going to, just as you saw me do, wring out as much of the water as you can get out. The more water that stays in, the more sort of stretch and give that you're going to be able to do with your fabric, but the longer it's going to take to dry. So it depends on what you're trying to achieve. And again, if you're being fairly gentle like you saw me do, you should not have to worry about anything felting on you at all. Once you have that part done and it's fully saturated in warm water, you've wrung out a fair amount of the water around it, the last step of blocking is truly just to lay your piece out the way that you want it to look. You can use blocking pins to kind of hold things in place, but for a project like this where I'm not really trying to change the shape of it or the size of it all that much, you don't need blocking pins. I am just going to kind of stretch with my fingers, and you'll remember before we blocked it, it looked like this piece, which is a ribbing section, which kind of likes to pull in, looked like it got smaller than the pieces around it. And once we have done our blocking, you can get that to lay perfectly even so that it's not pulling in any longer. So you're just going to go through and kind of stretch and pull things until everything looks like it's laying nicely, the edges are even, and you like the way it looks. Once you've laid the entire piece out like that, you are just going to wait for it to dry. And that's all there is to blocking. It's not a scary thing, it's not a time-consuming thing, and it's very easy to do. So block your work when you're done because it makes it look a lot nicer.